Dr. Crookston moved here from Minnesota about a year before I did, so I feel like I have something in common with him, although we didn't know one another in Minnesota. But we've certainly had an enjoyable relationship here at BYU. Dr. R. Kent Crookston was raised on a wheat and dairy farm in Alberta, Canada. He served in the Canadian Army and spent 2 years in New Zealand as a missionary for the church. He received his BS in agronomy from BYU in 1968 and his PhD in plant physiology from the University of Minnesota in 1972. He held postdoctoral positions with Agriculture Canada and Cornell University. He spent 24 years on the faculty at the University of Minnesota, where he served as founding director of the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture and as head of the Department of Agronomy and Plant Genetics. In 1998, he returned to BYU as Dean of the College of Biology and Agriculture. He is currently Associate Director of the BYU Faculty Center, providing support to academic leaders here at the university. Kent has consulted extensively in the area of international rural development, primarily in Africa. He was resident coordinator on a U.S. State Department project in Morocco for 2 years in the 1980s and spent an additional year just a few years ago in Morocco doing leadership and humanitarian work. He has written 138 refereed research papers and abstracts, 45 popular publications, 14 book chapters, and 3 books. So he's well qualified to speak on this topic. Would you welcome with me Dr. Kent Crookston?
Thank you, Russ, and thanks to those of you who've come today. I need to say how supportive and helpful the people here in the library have been. We've moved our office into the library from the Wilkinson Center, and it's been a very nice reception, so thanks to them. I've spent a lot of my spare time for the last 4 or 5 years going through the Book of Mormon to find out what I could about the agriculture and ecology, and I was re-impressed, as I had been originally, that this is a sacred record. And, Nephi said, I don't write anything except I think it be sacred. He told Jacob, touch only lightly upon anything but what you have prophecies and teachings. And then, of course, Jacob and Mormon both said we can't write even 100th part of what we'd like to, let alone things about the people. So I thought, how much would I find? You wouldn't expect there to be much about agriculture and ecology in the book, but there is a lot. And I was floored, actually, when I finally got a bit of a handle on just how much was there. These are a listing of the words, ecological words, that are listed at least 20 or more times. You'll see that I only go down to 13, and there were 49. And I told Gail, I forgot I should have looked on some other things. She said, no, it's time to stop. And I have a pretty good picture, but the ones that are in red indicate whether they were referring to that, say, the wilderness as a natural thing that they lived in, or whether it was used in a spiritual sense. And of course, fruit, seeds, trees, vineyards. Vineyards is only mentioned once as a natural vineyard, and you get an idea of the balance of what. But you go down to the bottom, and of the ones that are the total, it's 700 to 500 where they're used spiritually as opposed to just naturally. So I didn't focus on either one so much, although because I'd spend a couple of days or nights and have nothing, because I got caught up in the spiritual part of the text, which was a good exercise for me. The thing that got me originally interested in this aspect of the text was when I was reading after I got my PhD in plant physiology, and I was reading and came upon this statement about Nephi, what he said about his seeds. So we're in 1 Nephi chapter 8, and that's when they've come back again from the land of Jerusalem with Ishmael and his daughters. And they're back with the tent of their father, and he throws in this verse and then goes back to the story. And it's interesting, he throws in the verse about seeds. Let me read it. And it came to pass that we had gathered together all manner of seeds of every kind, both of grain of every kind and also of the seeds of fruit of every kind. And I thought, yeah, especially after we lived in Morocco, if you came from Jerusalem, there would have seeds of every kind. There's no place like a Mediterranean climate to have pretty much anything that'll grow. If they'd have come out of Finland, they wouldn't have had much seeds that they could have brought. Almost all of these are a validation of the text. I don't think Joseph would have thought to write that they had seeds of every kind. Well, then you get down later when they are in the New World. That's the second quote. I'll read the whole thing to that also. And it came to pass that we did begin to till the earth, and we began to plant seeds. Yea, we did put all our seeds into the earth, which we had brought from the land of Jerusalem. And it came to pass that they did grow exceedingly, wherefore we were blessed in abundance. Again, I thought, bingo, he's validating, the text is validated by this statement. He had been used to seeing things grow back in Jerusalem, those soils would have been tired, in terms of the nutrients available to the plants. And if they got to the New World, turned over some virgin sod, we all know the sod effect, and boom, there's just a frenzy of microbial activity to release nutrients, and whoa, I didn't expect to see things growing quite like that. So again, Joseph might have known about that, but what also intrigued me was from the land of Jerusalem. And that gave me pause. And I thought, if he brought seeds of grain and fruit of every kind from the land of Jerusalem, where would it be good for him to land so they'd all grow well? Out of a Mediterranean climate, he ought to land in another Mediterranean climate. So in the New World, where would that be? And so I'm looking at the latitude of Jerusalem. 31 degrees north would be about Beersheba, and 33 would be north of the Sea of Galilee. So that takes in, we don't know exactly where Lehi lived, but he's going to be within that belt somewhere. And then in the New World, they were blessed in abundance, and so I'm thinking, all right, looking at Mediterranean climates, you can see in the red where the Mediterranean basin is, and in Americas, you've got California or central Chile. So it's San Diego or Santiago. And if we want him to be in the North American continent, then it would be San Diego. And for other reasons, that makes more sense than, I'll talk about that a little bit later, like where the Jaredites would have landed. And so the California area starts to make good sense. And why I mentioned the latitude. Why would latitude matter? Well, from a physiology of plant standpoint, it matters a lot. This is a map of Wisconsin, and you'll see they have 7 different maturity zones with numbers on them. And if you're going to sell corn in the state of Wisconsin, if you're a commercial seed seller, you have to, and you say you want to sell it for that middle zone of 95, you can't sell your seed there unless it's been tested to be sure that it's fit for that zone. You don't want a farmer growing stuff that's going to be maturing way early and waste the season, or way late and be caught by the frost before it's mature. So there's a government program run through the university, and they test seeds before they can be sold, so that the farmer's not going to be disappointed. Now, if the phytochrome, I just put up a color band there because it's a pigment in the plants, and it's also a hormone. So phytochrome it operates in the far red version of the spectrum. In other words, it's responsive to that spectrum of light. And I brought this ruler so that maybe I can demonstrate if phytochrome it'll move like let's say it's in resting position. If it goes over here, ding, it's going to ring the florogen bell. There's another hormone that will induce the floral structures of the plant. So it's sitting over here waiting for the right length of night so that it can go over there and initiate flowers. So when the sun goes down, then this clock starts moving over there. And the sun comes up, it goes back again, because the night was too short. If the night's long enough to let it go over and ding, ring the florogen bell then, and that picture of corn in the bottom is about the stage, actually even earlier than that, when if the plant is growing where it belongs, and at that stage it'll already have initiated the cellular initials for the kernels and the silks and the tassels and the pollen. And as it grows up, then those are there. And if we brought some corn up from Texas to Wisconsin or Minnesota, And so up in Wisconsin, the nights are shorter than they are in Texas. And so here's this thing going over, and it's frustrated. It just never gets to go over and initiate flowers because the sun's up, has to go back. Sun's up, has to go back. And so what happens is that Texas corn up in the northern United States will grow 12, maybe 13 feet tall. It's amazing. And there's no grain. So that'd be kind of disappointing if you're hoping for grain. And if you took some Minnesota corn down to Texas, well, the nights are so long that, bam, the first night it's initiated the florigen. And so you've got these little flower initials before the plant even had a chance to get going. And it'd be a little less than knee-high, and you'd have a little runt kernel about like that strawberry popcorn you see in the stores that are cute. And so you're frustrated that way. So here's Nephi, got all these seeds of grains and fruit of every kind, and the whole menagerie of them are going to have to go somewhere where they're all going to respond to the day length and grow and produce fruit. And it's times also, their maturity, the senescence, the whole program of the plant is going to be timed that way. So I'm going to want Nephi to have landed in San Diego if he's blessed in abundance and amazed by how they grew. And I thought, well, this is different. I wasn't taught that when I was a kid. In fact, I wasn't taught that when I went to BYU either. Maybe I'm wrong, but I have this hypothesis that I've got the latitudes in there, and down the bottom, the small print, the Jerusalem city and the top of the Red Sea where they are. So I developed a hypothesis that the Book of Mormon record keepers lived in a Mediterranean. Why do I say record keepers? There are probably all kinds of Book of Mormon characters, especially Jaredites. There were friends of Jared, at least 11 of them, that they had families with them. We don't know where they went. We don't have their record. And probably there was some of the Lehi party that took off and went places we don't know about either. We don't have their record. But we do have a record of the ones that stayed close to home. We know the whole 1,000 years they were within the range of the land of Nephi and the land of Zarahemla. So my hypothesis is that those people that kept the record that we have lived in a Mediterranean climate. Now, since there's not 100th part of what I'm looking for that they could even write about, how much would I find? And so I began my search. But one of the things that caught my attention was the separate seasons of fruit and of grain. Well, we lived in Morocco for 3 years, and the harvest seasons there are distinctly separate. The grains come off about March. Maybe it depends on which one you're growing, but they're for sure finished by June. And the fruit doesn't come in until about, depending on the fruit, some does, but about October, November. So they're distinctly separate seasons when you harvest the grain and when you harvest the fruit. Now this is when Nephi, son of Helaman, called for this ravaging drought and famine, and then he called for it after they'd repented. He said, let's stop it. So they stopped it, and this is the way it happened. The earth brought forth her fruit in the season of her fruit. And it came to pass, which suggests it was a little while later, it did bring forth her grain in the season of her grain. Now, I could spend some time about how the Moroccan farmers used the timing of the moisture to plant, but this makes perfect sense if you're in a Mediterranean climate. So that was one. And by the way, that little green box down in the right-hand corner, that's just me saying that it works. My hypothesis is not dismissed by what is said here. When I read the text, it appears to me that water was scarce. Take the waters of Sebus. Now, this is Freeburg's painting of the waters of Sebus, and you see those hooligans coming after him with the clubs, and he's defending these sheep. There's something, I like the picture, it's very well done, he's a good artist, but notice that river in the back. What the heck were they running away from the hooligans? Why didn't they go another part of the river to get their water? And why did those guys go to the water of Sebus when they knew their lives were at risk? They're going to be killed, either by the hooligans or by the king, because the flocks are scattered. It had to be a desperate place, desperate in terms of finding water, and they had to go there. So I'm concluding it was a dry place. Mormon and Helam are both mentioned, the waters of Mormon and the waters in Helam, as pure. Now, both Alma and Mormon retained that water, that wording. It must have been significant. I'm just hypothesizing that there wasn't pure water everywhere. You wouldn't bother to mention that the water was pure. Again, why wouldn't it have been pure? Was it because there were salts, or was it, I don't doubt there were pollutants, but It's not easy to find pure water in a dry area because of the evaporation and the residues that are left. And then you get the land northward, many waters. I was just talking to Russ, living in Minnesota. You go up into where Richard's from, up into Manitoba, and there's a lot of lakes in Manitoba. You don't come back to Minnesota and say, man, there's a lot of lakes in Manitoba. Well, there's a lot of lakes in Minnesota too, so you don't even think about it. But when you go to a land and come back and say, you know what, there was water up there. It must mean that where you were is not used to seeing a lot of water. You wouldn't bother to mention it. So I'm concluding that it was rather dry where they lived. I'm going to have to talk about these sheep in a minute. Now, also the land north of many waters, there was a most unusual forest ecology. The text says the land had been rendered desolate and without timber. And when they got up there, these 5,000 people and their wives and children and Helaman III, that they suffered whatsoever tree should spring up to grow so that they might have timber. And then these guys shipped timber up to them to help them build their houses. I put 500 plus years because you can calculate. When Coriantumr bumped into the Mulekites, it would, I'm guessing, what, 575, 580 BC? And this report was about 50 BC, or 80, I'm not sure, somewhere in that window. So it's been a long time since those people destroyed the place and took the trees out, and they haven't come back. What kind of ecology would allow that to happen? Jungle, boom, it's back before you turn around. Woods like Joseph Smith knew in New York, you cut your trees down, and by the time you get your fences built, the trees are coming up again. So it helped me to have lived in Morocco because I thought of at least a couple of places where this kind of thing has happened. One is the Cedars of Lebanon. They were very popular, extremely, Solomon built his temple and his palace out of the cedars, and they're mentioned in the Bible frequently. Once they took them down, they still haven't come back in Lebanon. There's still a few in Turkey, I understand. And efforts to reestablish them and have established them have just not succeeded. The Atlas cedars of Morocco, I'm told, are very similar to the cedars of Lebanon. And it's discouraging to drive around Morocco and see some pockets in the mountains where there were cedars. There's maybe one left, but it's old and about to expire. And 30 years ago when we lived there, they were trying to reestablish the cedars, and it just wasn't working. They had little micro emitters, and they were putting up shades. They didn't want to come back. Now, we were there 2 years ago, and there were some cedars as tall as this room. So they were getting to come back. So if I could pull that, I should have thrown in that Mediterranean map again. But Lebanon and Morocco are on the exact same latitude, and the climate is Mediterranean. Now, we got to find a latitude and climate similar to that if we want to have it make sense that the trees didn't come back, and so that puts you in that part of California again. Maybe they were sequoias, we don't know. But again, a validation of the text. Who would have thought to suggest the trees didn't come back? Then this other comment, they became exceedingly expert in the working of cement. They did build houses of cement in which they did dwell. I found it interesting that they didn't say anything about stone, that they were sticking the stones together with the cement and becoming exceedingly expert. Again, I'm handicapped, if you will, or advantaged by having lived in Morocco, where they build houses out of what they call cement, and it's really rammed earth. Whoops, I went to, so this is a rammed earth village out in the Sahara side of Morocco. They're all over Morocco. This is just kind of a spectacular one. So that they do this by having, if you can see this table, they have forms that are about as wide as that, tough timbers, and they can brace them, and then they take soil that's just the right moisture. It doesn't seem to, the composition is as important as how wet it is. And they have a ramming, bam, bam, and they ram that dirt till it won't be rammed anymore. They pour some more in and ram that, and when they get up as tall as that table, they take the forms out, move them up, bolt them, and ram again. And so you see it all the time still, building walls, especially out in the countryside. But they became expert. These houses are all out of rammed earth, which if it doesn't get too much moisture on it, can stay. There's a wall around the city of Fez that's been there since the time of Louis XIV, and we went out, scratch it, and it was like sandstone. So it sort of petrifies. And you can see the expertise in the designs in that. So I just hypothesizing a candidate that their cement might have been rammed earth. They said that they shipped timbers up there, which facilitated in the building of their houses of cement. And you could use them in no forms and ramming. That's just a guess. But here we are inside. That's Gail looking back at us, and we're looking out of a door. And you can see those in the background are deteriorating a little bit. Had they built their houses out of rammed earth 2,000 years ago, and they had not kept them up, we wouldn't expect to see much anymore. So in terms of archaeological evidence of those houses of cement, you would expect that you wouldn't find much unless you really knew where to look. Forests, woods, I'm going to move to this. I put underline the S because of forests, plural. And that to me made some, it was important to think of it as them talking about their forests in plural form. Nephi said we went into the forests, not the forest, which suggests there were clumps of trees scattered about. Enos, when he went hunting, he also went into the forests. Now, the one that I think is even more persuasive is the case of Limhi. He was up on the tower looking out and saw the Lamanites making war preparations and coming. It's the same tower that Noah, I don't know if it's the same tower. He's the son of Noah. But I'm concluding it's the same tower, a very high tower. Noah, remember, Gideon was chasing him up there, and they saw the Lamanites coming, and he said, oh, we got to run. So they both ran. They had time to get down off the tower, get their women and children, and get out. Limhi had time to get down and get people and place themselves, as he said, in the fields and in the forests to lay wait for the Lamanites and spring upon them and counter their attack. So there's quite a lot of information there if you think about it. From the tower, they could see them a great distance. Plenty of time for them to make preparations and actually go out and wait to intercept them. So there wouldn't have been these towering forests or jungles between the tower and the Lamanites, or they wouldn't have been able to see them coming. They'd just sneak through the jungle. Ha! Surprise. Not only that, they go out then, and there's fields and forests. So you've got to have some patchwork. I'm thinking of clumps of trees and fields in between. You could hide in the trees and then jump out on them. And the trees have got to be kind of small. At least that's my conclusion from reading the text. Now, forest, single, of Mormon, it was described as near the waters where they did their baptism was a thicket of small trees where they could hide in the daytime from the searches of the king. So although the fact that they say small indicates that there must have been some tall ones or they wouldn't have bothered to describe them as small. And we know that there were timbers that they shipped, up from where Hagoth was building. He made a very large ship. He must have had some tall trees. But just interesting insights about what the trees were probably like. And I could spend more time, but I've got other things I want to cover, so I'm going to move on. Again, my hypothesis is not dismissed by the description of the forest being a Mediterranean climate. If it was rough, then you'd expect on the southern exposures, taking the pounding of the sun, you might have no trees at all, or some very short ones on the flat. And on the northern slopes, you could have some tall ones, and depending upon the altitude, etc. Wilderness, my goodness. You can't go anywhere in the Book of Mormon without coming upon a discussion of the wilderness. Of all the words, you can see how it's used more than any, and most of them are actual rather than spiritual. And I'm not going to say anything else except that's just to tell us how frequent they use the wilderness word. And in fact, I think did I bring it here, the quote? I'll see if I can find it. When Mosiah departed out of the land of Nephi and headed for Zarahemla the first time, it says Mosiah departed out of the land into the wilderness, and they were led by the power of the Lord's arm through the wilderness until they came down to the land which is called the land of Zarahemla. Nephi did the same thing in the old world. We were camped in the wilderness. We went into the wilderness. We came back into the wilderness. I mean, and the sons of Mosiah, when they went on their mission, they didn't just go to the Lamanites in the land. They took their journey into the wilderness to go up and preach. So a whole lot of it is we were lost in the wilderness. We wandered in the wilderness. So the wilderness, there must have been a lot of wilderness. It was important to those guys, we see that there were beasts of every kind. You see the descriptions of what they journeyed through, marched in, pitched their tents in, hid in, became lost in, and could no longer follow tracks. Now that was interesting to me. these Lamanites are not behind Limhi and his party very close, or Alma when he's escaping Helam. And they said they're taking all their stuff. They've got grandma and the animals, and I mean, so they're not going to tiptoe through leaving no tracks. But yet they couldn't follow their tracks. What kind of ecology would permit that? Think of that kind of a party tromping through the jungle, and well, where'd they go? It'd be pretty easy to see where they went. But if it was rocky, like it is in Jerusalem, and especially if it were rough, so that if it were cloudy, and these Lamanites, when they lost them, they couldn't find the way home. They were lost. What? So a rough terrain that's dry and not leaving tracks, especially if it's cloudy and you get disoriented, it would be tough to find, tough your way back. And as Nibley pointed out, where there's no water, it's especially easy to become lost because you can't take your bearings by the rivers and the streams that run into them. So I'm concluding again that the wilderness, these descriptions of it, do not dismiss my hypothesis. I'm going to step into agriculture now, and we know in the record that this all started with the Jaredites. They mentioned tools to work their animals and how they tilled the soil, and they like Nephi, all manners of fruit and grain, which is what you'd expect, again, Mediterranean climate. But all these cattle, that's quite a list, especially the elephants, the Kirlams, and Kumams. And keeping those animals in mind, then we switched to Nephi. What he encountered there's no indication that they took any animals with them on their boat. We don't know anything about what the Mulekites had. But it might be that those animals that the Jaredites brought were the ones that were hanging around for Nephi to find when he landed. They're quite similar, but my question's in red. Were they left over? If so, how had they survived? Because there were a lot of ravenous beasts in the wilderness. Nephi didn't find any sheep. He didn't, at least he didn't say that he did. The sheep that are mentioned up there in the Jaredite group, that's the only mention of sheep in the Book of Mormon. You probably don't believe me, but it's true, unless you can search different than I did. Now, there's mention of sheep as, the Lord's sheep, or I'll come to that in a minute. But so I'm just, I thought, were there sheep? Did the flocks that Ammon was defending from the hooligans at the water of Sebus, flocks of what? We don't know. It doesn't say. Flocks are mentioned, I think, about 20 times, but it doesn't say flocks of what. Could have been flocks of turkeys. Though I'm partly serious because I researched some. I researched turkeys, and I didn't know this, but they originated in Mexico. In fact, they took turkeys back with them to Europe after these Spanish discovered the New World and introduced them into Europe, and the Pilgrims brought turkeys with them on the Mayflower, thinking they'd want to have some when they got to the New World. We thought that the Indians gave them to them. Probably did. They probably had some better ones over here, but anyway, we just don't know what those flocks were. And by the way, you see cattle up in there, all manner of cattle that the Jaredites had. A fascinating thing about the Book of Mormon is that it is written in King James style English, and that there were the words and what they meant in the time of King James are some of them different than what we see them meaning today. Cattle, for example, when I look back to what did it mean at that time in the 1600s, cattle meant stuff that you could move. So your trunks and your maybe a little bit of your furniture, your belongings, and your animals, that was all cattle. By the time of Joseph Smith, it came to mean animals, but it didn't necessarily mean, so they say cattle, and then they throw in oxen and cows in addition to cattle. So what was the cattle? Is that just a generic to cover them all? We don't know. A lot of stuff we don't know, especially me. So the workable soils were obviously widespread. Tillage was noted at least 15 times. The Jaredite lands, the first inheritance, land of Nephi, all those other places. And then of interest to me was this description of what Captain Moroni did as a defensive tactic, piling up these high banks of earth around every city in all the land. So it wasn't this, they found some, this was diggable soil. not just a little bit of stuff and then bedrock. And in fact, the Lamanites, even at the risk of their lives, it must have been pretty easy because they were trying to dig it down in a hurry so they could get over the walls. But more important to me was the fact that the Lamanites, when they came, we're ready for those Nephites this time. We have our own armor on. We got heavy clothes too. But they weren't ready because the Nephites, surprise, had thrown up banks of earth around their cities. And the Lamanites stood there with their mouths open, utter astonishment. Did I bring that? I thought I tried. I've got it here somewhere, the description that I want to read. Where is it? Oh, yeah. To their utter astonishment, they were prepared for them in a manner which had never been known among the children of Lehi. So since Lehi, down to this time, which was 72 BC, they'd never seen piles of earth. Well, that's kind of interesting. If they had this phenomenal, impressive archaeology of great stone towers, would a pile of earth made them dumbstruck? It's a little diversion from agriculture, but it made me think, what would we find if we were to find the place where the record keepers lived? And then, of course, the land northward, that's interesting, as I mentioned, that maybe I didn't say this while I was there, but there was no part of that land that was desolate, save it were for timber. Now, I should have said this while that picture of Morocco was up there, but you can remember it. There was a river running by. It sounds like there was good soil there, and especially it must have been, or there wouldn't have been all those people leaving Zarahemla and going up there to populate it. It was probably more desirable than Zarahemla was. And it sounds an awful lot like what I saw in Morocco, where you had these wonderful soils miles from the mountains, where the waters came down, and trees didn't grow there because it was too dry. But if you were to irrigate and plant crops, they grew very well. So that land northward obviously had workable soils, or they wouldn't have been going in there. And it wasn't desolate, except there were no trees. So agricultural abundance is obvious. You find it all throughout the text. These are just some samples. The Jaredites prospered exceedingly. All these people, Zeniff, Noah, Nephi, reaped in abundance. Noah had wine in abundance. They had abundance of flocks, herds, fatlings, silk, linen. And the story of Laconius is pretty good, because they're going to take care of the Gadianton robbers, so they hold up for 7 years, and they were able to lay up provisions enough to last them for 7 years, the whole group of Nephites. So they couldn't have been just living from season to season. It's kind of like Joseph and his 7 good years in Egypt. So we know there was abundant agriculture. Here's a listing of the crops. This is complete, at least in terms of what I could find. So fruit, and again, see how it's all spiritual, almost all. Fruit of the loins, fruit of the tree of life, the Lehi's dream, vineyards, that's pretty much all out of the Zenos allegory. Wine is mentioned 15 times, but 8 times actual. And I'll talk about grapes a little bit later. You go down to number 10, and grapes, the only mention of them is spiritual. And wheat was mentioned, one, as Jesus says they want to sift you, as Satan sift you as wheat, and Zeniff mentioned wheat among the crops they grew in the land of Nephi. So that gives you some idea. Grain, of course, is almost all actual. And olives, we don't know that there were olives there. The allegory could have been a story that they told about the way things were in the old world. It's hard for me to believe, though, that Nephi wouldn't have brought some olive seeds with him. You won't get the olives you wanted, but they talk about wild olives in that allegory. Same thing for dates. Dates aren't mentioned. Who would have left Jerusalem without bringing some dates? You wouldn't have got the dates you had because the seeds aren't true, but after some selections, you could have come up with some pretty good stuff. Now, crops. I want to just focus on the grain. There's only 3 grains mentioned: barley, corn, and wheat. Barley was mentioned the most. And it was the basis of their Nephite monetary system. That really struck me as significant. Barley is a substandard grain. It's a cattle feed. It makes good beer. It's a tough crop to work with. It's raspy. The glumes don't come off. The coatings to the seed don't fall off like they do wheat. It doesn't have much, what is it called? The stuff you're not, gluten, so it doesn't make good bread. But why would you grow barley then? You wouldn't if you had a choice. You might for some cattle feed, but your premium grain would be wheat or corn. But if it's extremely dry and salty, bingo, you want barley. It's the most drought and salt tolerant crop that I'm aware of. Orders of magnitude more tolerant than the next closest grain, which suggests to me they were living in a pretty dry area. And it's a prominent Mediterranean crop because of the heat and the dryness. Let's take a look then at the grapes. Mentioned one time spiritual, but wine, as I said, 7 times as a product of the land. And this is Noah. He was a wine bibber, had a wine press. And then, of course, they gave the Lamanites their wine to get them to fall drunk and fall asleep so they could escape. And then the Lamanites, that was a good trick. So they poisoned theirs and brought it back, but they let a Lamanite taste their liquors before they drank any to see that they were safe. So you get wine mentioned 7 times that way. Again, a classical Mediterranean crop. By the way, barley, if you took barley down into the tropics, you'd be in trouble. There are fungal diseases that will take your barley out pretty quickly. And maybe they knew how to make, I don't know, before they had made selections, I'm pretty sure they would have lost their crop. Now, Nes and Sheem. I was really intrigued by the wording of the text in this case. We began to till the ground with all manner, now I've got the ofs in green, of seeds, of corn, of wheat, of barley. With Nes and with Sheem, there's no of, and there's no mention of seeds. And then seeds of all manner of fruits. I'm concluding they were vegetatively propagated. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go too fast on this, but speculation again, I'm speculating they were yucca and agave. Vegetatively propagated, those starchy roots are roasted, they have sweet fruit, all kinds of uses, medicine, soaps, fiber, liquors. And the people that came into the southwestern United States and northwestern Mexico said that there were all kinds of these stone pits where they roasted their yucca and agave. Total speculation, but could be. Animals, I just want to point out that lambs were mentioned once as actual, and that's because the Lamanites wore lambskins about their loins. That's the only mention of lambs. Sheep, once animals among the Jaredites. And if I had time, I could talk about these animals, but I can see I'm running out of time. But this suggests there really were sheep. Alma, what shepherd among you, having many sheep, and as sheep having no shepherd? This is in his Alma 5 lectures. So I think they knew what sheep were, and Jesus mentions as a metaphor, as a young lion among the flocks of sheep. This is what the children of Israel Judah will be like in the latter days. So we don't know about those sheep. Look at Curulams and Cumams, the CU and OMS. Those 2 animals must have been related or close by. Now, David makes me think of llamas and alpacas, camelids. Maybe there are even acronyms of, is that the word? Cognates of camelids. I don't know, but total speculation again. Now, what would it have been like living in a promised land? We see the promised land is in blue, and according to the text, it's a land that was prepared for, covenanted with, consecrated unto, preserved for, given to. It's mentioned in the Old Testament 10 times, in the Book of Mormon 49 times. So we've got Abraham, Moses, and Jerusalem being the promised land. Over on the other side, we've got a land choice above all other lands. Old Testament 0 times, Book of Mormon 10, suggests the land where the record keepers went was better than Jerusalem, because it's choice above all other lands. It must include Jerusalem. So we're in the New World with the land choice above all other lands. And it's kind of a bipolar promise, because if you behave yourselves, you get in the green box. Those are the things that will characterize your lifestyle. If you don't behave, you're over in the other half, and you're in trouble. And the book's full of this, isn't it? We see it happening all the time. But from an ecological standpoint, I'm asking, what would this look like ecologically to have a great famine cut off and bodies dwindling? And I default to Isaiah. These are the Isaiah verses in the Book of Mormon, where he talks about the Lord apparently had a vineyard in a very fruitful hill. Now, what am I going to do to that vineyard? I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll lay it waste. There'll be no rain, utterly desolate, great forsaking, and it'll come up briars and thorns. Briars and thorns, wow. Isaiah is awesome to read from an agricultural, ecological, natural. The whole thing is so poetic and full of animal and crops and harvesting. But the great forsaking reminds me of Paul, the description of Paul coming back into Jerusalem when they took him to the castle upon the steps. And when they gave him permission to speak, he spoke, and there was a great silence fell over the crowd. All that tells you is there was a great tumult before he spoke, so that the silence would be conspicuous. If there's a great forsaking, there must have been something that was not forsaken before. And so if we read out of Ether and Helaman that there was a great dearth upon the land northward was rendered desolate, the whole earth was smitten, then I wouldn't be surprised if the briars and thorns that Isaiah was seeing didn't apply to the new world promised land as well as the old. And that might be what you'd find if you were to find that promised land today, because who knows but what it isn't still in the same desolate state. There's no description in the text. All we know is that Moroni says, I'm alone and wandering. He didn't say anything about what had happened to the ecology. So I'm unable to refute my hypothesis, and maybe you'd find some stuff that would blast it, and I'd be really glad to visit with you about it. I do want to tell you, though, that if you take those latitudes of 31 to 33 degrees and put them around San Diego, you'll see where it fits. And that starts to get me to look at Baja, California. It has a Jerusalem climate and latitude. It's a very limited geography, which is what you find described in the text. They weren't going very far. For 1,000 years, they were still within that same area where the land of Nephi and Zarahemla were. The Jaredites, Lehites, and Mulekites all landed in the same area. The Jaredites took off without any sail or any means of steering. They were at the mercy of the winds and the currents. And my friend and colleague, Lynn Rosenval, who was a professor of geography up in Calgary, said if you were to launch a raft in the Pacific, which is where we assume, we think we can conclude the Jaredites went over there, anywhere from Philippines up to Japan, and then left it to the mercy of the winds and the currents, in about a year it would beach somewhere near San Diego. So that could put the Jaredites there, which is also where the Nephites and the Mulekites were, and they were all in the same area. Jacob described that they lived upon an isle of the sea, which in Joseph Smith's time meant a peninsula as much as anything else. And Mormon said we are both the land of Nephi and Zarahemla are nearly surrounded by water. So it makes you think, well, we better look at this and see if it was going to keep on fitting. There is a sea west and a sea east in the blue, and the location of lands and places are plausible if you try to poke them on this peninsula. You see the narrow strip of wilderness, Nephi, Zarahemla, bountiful, many waters. According to Mormon, the Lamanites were hemmed in at this area where there was a small neck. It took a day and a half to get across. And some of us have been down there, and yeah, it can be taken a day. I guess the right person could get across it in a day. Didn't it say in the text once that a Nephite went across it in a day? But the interesting thing about it is, on both sides, the Cortez side and the Pacific side, they're mountains, really rugged. You're not going to pass them, but there's a little bit of area you'd need to defend on both sides. And you could hem the Lamanites in. I've often thought, how did they hem them in anyway? Why didn't they go around them, for Pete's sake, and get on with their business and leave those poor Nephites alone? But remember, they said, and we could at our pleasure move northward as far as we wanted, but we're keeping the Lamanites hemmed in. Hard to figure out how you'd hem them in unless you had something like that geographical restriction. And always, 30, 40 times, both northward and southward is mentioned. Not north-south, but slanting, which that peninsula does. And I'm out of agriculture, but that peninsula has abundant gold, silver, and copper, which the text mentions many, many times. And not a lot of places do. So my picture, which was on the poster, on one of my trips down to Baja to just check the place out, we came upon this little valley, which was not that far from our hypothesized site for Helam. I took a picture and decided to paint it. So if you look on the map, you'll see Mormon proposed to be at that red dot, Helam at that other red dot, and Zarahemla up there, and we were in that valley. And it's where they called it Alma because he led their way in the wilderness. So for me, it's just been really fun and cool to go to a place that might be where it was. And I can now read the text and keep track of where they probably were, and there's just this special feeling, diluted or not. as my colleague John Livingston said, Baja humbug. But still, we're having a lot of fun exploring this possibility. I have a few pictures of Baja, just to go through quickly. Now this is that same valley. We were down there. I look like an old man hobbling over those stones, don't I? Probably because I am. But anyway, this is the valley now. That hurricane, 13 inches of rain, and this boulder, you can see the size of it. It's pretty much filled that valley, and my nice little syringe, it's all full of stones. Maybe another hurricane will wash them out again, but if that's true, it's another thing. What are you going to find archaeologically if this was the area with those kinds of storms? One of the things that is characteristic of Baja are these cast-up highways, these roads. The cast up mean the roads are cast up to the sides, at least that's our interpretation. And my friend David Rosenthal has gone in with Google Earth and found, you can see these roads from Google Earth, and he's put in white where we can find those roads from Google Earth, and this is our proposed site of Zarahemla and how those roads come into that. Pretty fast. We've walked some of those roads. It's again, fun to be there and think maybe this is where they were. This is me standing on a wall that was on two sides of the proposed site of Zarahemla, and down in the bottom it's silted in. You could drive a dump truck along the top of that. And so, by the way, the archaeological structures that are featured in the text are roads and walls. And the walls are defensive walls. We don't find any building walls mentioned, but and you know what? That last hurricane, it took this wall out. It's gone now. We don't know how old it was. We won't ever find out. Now we can't date it because it's gone. Here's another wall that Rick here found with Monty. Monty, are you in here somewhere? Monty was going to be here, but anyway. These walls, I don't have a good shot showing how they run, but they look to be tactical in terms of, like say, a defensive or military. They're just rough stone walls piled up there, and that's what they did with Captain Moroni, is pile up these stone walls in the land. And this is safe up high enough to be out of the hurricane storm's way. Here's some of the agriculture we found farther down south. It's very, very bountiful and abundant, as the text would suggest. Here's some of the water running out of our proposed site of Helam, where the water was notably pure. Here's me sitting at an old olive tree in the proposed site for the land of Helam. This, according to a fellow that we met there, the Jesuits, when they came in originally into California, was it in the 15 or 1600s, planted some olive trees, and then went away, and they came back and said, whoa, the trees grew, so they put a mission there. Most of the sites in Baja that we think might have been a candidate Book of Mormon site, there's a mission there because the Jesuits went where their people were living. So that all kind of makes good sense. Here's up in the land of Nephi, except for that hill back there and the cactus, I'd have thought I was back in Iowa. And that hill, by the way, could be the hill north of Shiloh. It's the only hill in that area around the land of Nephi where Ammon that went to find the descendants of Zeniff. His people hid up there while he went in to check things out, and then they went back and rescued him, and they were about to die of thirst, if you remember. So we know it was dry. This is a house where some people from Canada down there built a house, and you can see it's dried palm fronds and a minimal amount of timber, which makes good sense given the climate. If that was the housing, it would make good sense that that city of Zarahemla and a whole bunch of others burned coming to at the time of Jesus. And last picture, cave paintings. North and south of San Ignacio, which is where we propose Zarahemla was, there are, I don't know, is it hundreds of these caves? And these guys are like 35 feet tall. This is just a picture from my camera, so it's not the best, but there's books that show them really well. And there's a bunch of them that are shot full of arrows. Some of the animals are shot. There's jackrabbits or stingrays. It's an amazing. So we like to fancy that the Getty Anton robbers were cave painters as well. So I'm done. If you have questions, it looks like we have time for one or two. Oh, I'm going to stay here so I can repeat the question if somebody has one. Unless you want to come down here and ask the question in the mic. Yes, Lynn, or excuse me, Laurel.
Are you planning more excursions to further explore this?
Probably. We haven't got a date set for the next one. You know, there's a lot of stuff that really has to be done if we're going to seriously test the place, but that's a good question. But way in the back, yes. Dixon, is it? That the what has changed?
The land shape, that Baja Peninsula, are there coast lines that extend out further? Water drop?
We've had geologists with us on, and I don't remember that we've considered that question. There is a place up on the east side of the Land of Bountiful where there's a shearing off. It looks like could have happened. There's also a volcano out there that we don't know whether the darkness is volcanic or not, but that's still more stuff that really would have to be done in a more serious look, Dixon.
I ask because narrow neck land is not much different than the whole length of it, but maybe 1,000 years ago there was a little more extensive area.
And that the narrow neck would have been more unique, you mean?
Yeah.
Good. It's a good hypothesis. I don't know though. No. Yes. Mark.
With no scriptural or scientific study, I've always pictured in my mind this narrow neck of land.
Oh, it's Doug. Sorry.
That's Central America. I presume that's far too tropical for the ecological match that you were looking for.
Yeah, my mother taught me that. Of course, you look at the map. There's Peninsula. There's Panama. No, it doesn't fit ecologically. It doesn't fit agriculturally, and it's more than a day and a half across that peninsula. Yeah, Brian.
So as a soil scientist, the soils in that part of the world, in the Central American part of the world, really aren't very productive. You know, I mean, it really contradicts what I read in the Book of Mormon. And so the hypothesis that it's in Central America, from a soils and a productivity standpoint, doesn't make much sense to me.
I've been omitting to repeat the question, and but Brian, as a soil scientist, is saying the soils in Central America aren't that productive, and from reading what you can in the Book of Mormon, it's not a good soils fit to the text. Is that right?
Yeah, these tropical soils are very nutrient depleted, and you know, if you look at what indigenous people are growing, you know, they're struggling to get yields. I certainly wouldn't call them productive soils.
Yeah, the grapes, the barley, they wouldn't. You don't expect to find them in the tropical areas, but you do in a Mediterranean area. Yes, back over there. Is that? Hi, Jeff. Any indication of people on the peninsula? Prior to the Catholic, yes, there were indigenous peoples. One of the frustrating things is, according to those first records, the people that were there had some written records. They were on wooden tablets, and of course they were quickly burned because they were pagan. This is spurious, but there's a fellow up here in the canyon that goes down doing humanitarian work in Mexico, and there's a group of Indians called the Seri, S-E-R-I, Seri Indians, that he noticed looked different than the ones that he was seeing all over the place, and they had been moved. There's a large island, the largest one in the Sea of Cortez, where the Seris inhabited forever, and they were moved off because the Mexicans wanted to make that a natural preserve, so they're kind of displaced. And he said to this fellow, "You look different than the rest of these Indians." And he said, "Oh, we are." He said, "We're pure Israelites. We always have been." And I thought, it'd be fun to go talk to them before the missionaries tell them who they are, but I haven't done that. Yes. Bahia, okay, yeah. You're on the peninsula side then. Yeah, apparently those shell mounds, there's lots of them especially on the Cortez side. And of course, we have nothing in the text to help us verify that that's what they did, but the only reference I could find that they were harvesting the sea is that they had pearls among their abundance.
But those foods wouldn't have been kosher.
So Rick's pointing out those foods would not have been kosher for the law of Moses, so there would have been Lamanites eating those shells. Unless they're Jack Nephites. Oh, yes.
Any dates on the cave paintings?
No, I'm not aware of any dates. There's, David, you know anything about whether they, or Jim, they've been dated? Couple of them show horses, and so the conclusion, oh, then they're post-Columbus. I bet they're not organic pigments, so it's a little tough. I'm sure that if we got the right people down there seriously dating, they could figure it out.
Perhaps with rock weathering.
Yeah. These are not actually caves as much as they're like southern Utah, where there's things that fallen away and there's a shelter that you can just get under. So you don't need lights to see them. The daylight does fine. Well, oh, yes.
I'm intrigued by the fact that for Alma and Limhi and the priests of Noah and the Lamanite king, it seemed like it was very hard to get around that area, easy to get lost. They needed Alma to show them the way. Does the peninsula reflect that kind of topography where it would be so difficult to navigate?
It does. I think you heard Mark's comment. Did anybody not? We were down there, and there was a woman that was in the San Ignacio, or proposed Zarahemla site, that said she would take us and show us some petroglyphs. And she knew the way. So we walked up in there. It was a cloudy day. And I have an extremely powerful sense of direction, Mark. It just isn't accurate. So I always have a very strong feeling of where north is. It doesn't matter whether it's right or not, it's just still there. Well, I was totally turned around having walked up in there, and I was going to head off a different direction to get back. So it's rough, and you can't see very far to the horizon unless you're at a vantage point, but even then, it's rugged like dog's teeth, if not worse. I was amazed. And so thinking, well, you know, where's the horizon? Where's that plain? And there's no rivers to follow. So it seems like the perfect place to me to get lost and not to be able to follow your own tracks back.
And what about the riverside?
There is one river that is notable in Baja, and it comes out of San Ignacio and runs into the Pacific. Now, some of the models have it running north. If you look closely at the text, that can be debated. And so John Livingston isn't here. I was with him when he tried to jump it and fell in there, and we told him he'd been baptized in the river, but he was just going to jump onto a stone. There would be times when it was a raging torrent, and other times when it would barely be a trickle, depending upon, you know, the rainy season, or especially if a typhoon came in. And you notice in the text it said, we presume their bodies are washed to the sea. So it'd been some time, and if the battle had left them in that riverbed, they might not be sure, but assuming there had been rains, probably they're washed to the sea. Did that help? Some people are getting a little antsy and might need to leave. Should we let a few go, or I mean, feel free to leave. Brian, I can see you got to go somewhere. So, yeah, thanks. Was that a question that's leaving now, or? Yeah.
I was just going to ask you where the volcanoes are.
The dormant volcano that I'm aware of, and there may be others, is out in the Sea of Cortez.
There aren't any around there that would satisfy my perspective. I'm Mark Wallace. The kinds of things that I see in the destruction
In what?
at the time of the Great Destruction.
Yeah, the text doesn't help us much because it doesn't say it was volcanoes.
Well, it's pretty clear whether it's a volcano.
Yeah, well, okay, I'll have to sit with you, Bart. I mean, I don't know if this volcano is mentioned in the text, but
Mention it as volcano, it just describes every feature of the massive volcano.
yeah, it does. And so the one that would satisfy in terms of the land of bountiful and Zarahemla, it's huge, and it's in the right wind path.
I'm not aware of it. It's there.
Yeah.
You mean Tres Vírgenes, Tres Vírgenes?
Is that it?
Or, yeah, or Isla Tortuga.
So,
In the wrong tectonic province with Baja or those kind of massive volcanic eruptions. They
Yeah.
occur to the south of Baja, and they occur to the north in California, but along the stretch from San Francisco down to the tip of Baja, there are no historic large volcanic eruptions that would satisfy that kind of a feature.
well, the geologist that was with us said that did satisfy, but I'm not worried about that as much as I am the ecology, because from an ecological standpoint, if you don't have the right ecology and biology, then you don't have anything to talk about.
Intrigued by your ecology.
Yeah.
On the other hand, years spent cruising across central Mexico in places, I can see there.
It's pretty fascinating, actually, and I've taken the posture that, well, maybe we're not ever supposed to know that this is a sacred text, and so forget trying to figure out where it was. And then they say, well, does it dilute the impact of the New Testament to know where it occurred? And no, it doesn't. But it's an intriguing topic. Rick, it looks like you're going to say something.
Oh, no.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Bart. Back in the back, I see a hand.
Dr. Natalie first was up by San Diego, and then the land of Nephi clear down by Crookston, down the southern tip. But there seems to be the Nephi reaping the Lamanites and going up to the land of Nephi. Everything seems to be flipped from the land of the first inheritance.
Right, thanks. I appreciate you bringing that. He's saying that the San Diego, the perfect match to Jerusalem, is quite a ways north, whereas the text suggests they kept moving northward from the original landing site. And with this phytochrome thing I was talking about, if you're going to be off of the perfect match, you want to go south. If you go terribly far south, then you'll be seriously disappointed. But you can go a few hundred miles, and what will happen is most of your things will mature earlier than you thought, but you'll get a decent harvest. If you go north, then they won't mature, and the flower structures won't even be initiated. So it doesn't destroy the hypothesis to have them starting farther south. I meant to point that out, and I'm glad you asked that. I think the questions have stopped. So,
Exhausted them.
yep.
Okay, well, one more round of applause.